The steam rose from the coffee mug like morning fog, carrying with it the rich aroma of Colombian dark roast that Claire Morgan had once loved. Now, as she stared at the innocent-looking cup sitting on her kitchen counter, her stomach churned with a mixture of dread and determination. For 3 weeks, she had been pretending to drink the coffee her husband David prepared for her each morning, secretly pouring it down the bathroom sink while he wasn't looking. The metallic taste that had begun appearing in her morning brew, the unexplained dizzy spells that followed, and the way David's eyes lingered on her with something that wasn't quite love anymore, had all led to this moment of terrible clarity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Claire Morgan had always believed that 13 years of marriage meant knowing someone completely. She could predict that David would leave his coffee mug exactly 2 inches from the edge of the sink, that he would check his phone precisely 4 times during breakfast, and that he would kiss her forehead before heading to his job at Midwest Insurance Adjusters, with the same mechanical affection he had shown for the past 5 years. What she hadn't predicted was that the man she had trusted with her life might actually be trying to take it. The realization had crept in slowly, like frost forming on a window. It started with small things that seemed innocent enough on their own. David had suddenly taken over the morning coffee routine 6 months ago, claiming he wanted to treat her to a perfect cup before her long days at the Grandview Community Center. At first, Claire had been touched by the gesture. Her husband wasn't typically romantic, and after years of managing their household finances, organizing community events, and dealing with his increasingly distant behavior, she had welcomed any sign that he still cared. The first time she noticed the metallic taste, she had assumed it was a new coffee blend. David had always been particular about his beans, often ordering expensive varieties online that arrived in brown packages with exotic postmarks. When she mentioned the unusual flavor, he had brushed off her concerns with a laugh, suggesting that her taste buds were probably affected by the seasonal allergies that had been bothering her. It made sense at the time, and Claire had pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the stack of event proposals waiting on her desk at work. But the metallic taste persisted, accompanied by symptoms that grew more troubling with each passing day. 30 minutes after finishing her morning coffee, Claire would experience waves of nausea that made it difficult to concentrate during her morning meetings. Her hands would develop a slight tremor that made typing challenging, and a persistent headache would settle behind her eyes like a vibe. Most concerning of all were the dizzy spells that seemed to come from nowhere, leaving her gripping the edge of her desk while the room spun around her. David's reaction to her growing illness had been strange in ways that Claire couldn't quite articulate at first. While he expressed concern when she mentioned feeling unwell, there was something hollow about his sympathy, like an actor reciting lines he had memorized but didn't truly understand. He suggested doctor's visits with an urgency that seemed performative, and when she mentioned skipping coffee to see if it would help her stomach, his insistence that she maintain her routine struck her as oddly forceful. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in late September when Claire, feeling particularly nauseated after her coffee, had rushed to the bathroom and caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that reminded her of patients she had cared for during her nursing days. Patients whose bodies were fighting against something toxic. The recognition hit her like a physical blow, and she found herself gripping the bathroom sink as memories from her medical training surfaced unbidden. She had specialized in emergency nursing before leaving the profession to work at the community center, and she remembered the subtle signs of poisoning that doctors often missed in the early stages. The metallic taste could indicate heavy metal poisoning, while the combination of nausea, tremors, and headaches matched several toxic substances that were readily available to someone with the right knowledge. David worked in insurance, which meant he had access to case files involving accidental poisonings, industrial accidents, and suspicious deaths. He would know exactly what symptoms to expect and how to make them appear gradual and natural. That evening, Claire had sat across from David at their dinner table, watching him cut his steak with methodical precision while discussing his day in the same monotone voice he had used for months. She found herself studying his face as if seeing it for the first time, searching for signs of the man who had once made her laugh until her sides ached, who had held her through her father's death and supported her career change when nursing became too emotionally demanding. The stranger sitting across from her bore David's features, but his eyes held a coldness that made her blood run cold. The house they shared on Maple Street had always felt like a sanctuary, with its wraparound porch and the oak trees that David had planted during their second year of marriage. Now every familiar detail took on a sinister quality. The kitchen where they had cooked countless meals together became a crime scene in her mind, and the coffee maker that had been David's gift to her last Christmas transformed into a weapon of slow, deliberate murder. Sleep became elusive as Claire's mind raced through possible explanations for David's behavior. Their marriage had grown strained over the past 2 years, particularly after her miscarriage, and the subsequent struggles with fertility treatments that had drained both their emotional and financial resources. David had withdrawn during that period, spending more time at work and less time engaging with her attempts to rebuild their connection. But even at their lowest points, Claire had never imagined that disappointment and distance could evolve into something as sinister as murder. The financial implications began to crystallize as Claire lay awake during the long October nights. David handled their insurance policies, and she knew that her life insurance policy had been increased significantly just 8 months ago. At the time, David had explained it as a smart financial move given her age and health status, suggesting that locking in lower premiums while she was still young and healthy would benefit them in the long run. The timing now seemed far from coincidental. Claire's mind turned to her work at the community center, where she had organized dozens of charity events and fundraisers over the past 5 years. Her colleagues knew her as someone who paid attention to details, who could spot discrepancies in budgets and event planning that others missed. Those same analytical skills now served a darker purpose as she began to piece together a timeline of David's behavior changes and her own declining health. The realization that her husband might be slowly killing her should have sent her running to the police or to the emergency room. Instead, it filled her with a cold fury that surprised her with its intensity. Claire had spent most of her adult life caring for others, first as a nurse and then as someone who dedicated her time to improving her community. The idea that someone she had loved and trusted could betray that fundamental part of who she was felt like a violation that went beyond attempted murder. On the Thursday morning that would change everything, Claire made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Instead of confronting David or seeking immediate help, she chose to gather evidence. Her nursing background had taught her the importance of documentation, and her work organizing events had honed her ability to plan complex operations with multiple moving parts. If David thought he could manipulate and poison her without consequences, he was about to learn that his victim was far from helpless. The plan began with the coffee itself. Instead of drinking the potentially contaminated brew that David prepared each morning, Claire would dispose of it secretly while maintaining the appearance of her normal routine. She practiced the deception for several days, timing her movements to ensure that David wouldn't notice her trips to the bathroom immediately after breakfast. The metallic taste that had plagued her for weeks disappeared within 2 days of avoiding the coffee, confirming her worst suspicions about its contents. But Claire's plan extended far beyond simply avoiding the poison. She began paying attention to David's movements with the focus of a detective, noting when he prepared the coffee, where he stored his supplies, and whether he followed any unusual routines that might provide clues about what he was using and how he was administering it. She started keeping a detailed journal hidden in her desk at work, documenting her symptoms, David's behavior, and any unusual circumstances that might be relevant later. The community center became her refuge and her base of operation. Her office there provided a safe space where she could research poisoning symptoms, document her experiences, and begin reaching out to people who might be able to help her gather evidence. Claire's position as an events coordinator meant that she had connections throughout Cedar Falls, including relationships with local law enforcement officers who had worked security for community events and medical professionals who had volunteered their time for health fairs and charity drives. Dr. Patricia Wells had been one of those volunteers, donating her time to provide basic health screenings at the annual Cedar Falls Health and Wellness Fair that Claire had organized just 3 months earlier. The doctor had impressed Claire with her thorough approach and her ability to listen carefully to people's concerns without dismissing them. If anyone would take her suspicions seriously and help her gather medical evidence, it would be Dr. Wells. The decision to involve her brother Michael came after a sleepless night spent weighing her options. Michael lived just 40 minutes away in Madison, where he worked as a forensic accountant for a firm that specialized in fraud investigation. His analytical mind and professional experience with financial crimes could prove invaluable if David's motives were connected to money, insurance, or other financial benefits. More importantly, Michael was someone she could trust completely, someone who would believe her story and help her navigate the complex process of gathering evidence without alerting David to her suspicion. Claire's Aunt Helen had always been the family's voice of wisdom, the person everyone turned to when they needed advice or perspective on difficult situations. At 72, Helen Carter had seen enough of life to understand the darker sides of human nature while maintaining an optimism that never seemed forced or naive. She had been married to Claire's uncle Robert for 45 years before his death from cancer 2 years earlier, and her insights into long-term relationships and the ways that people could change over time would be crucial in helping Claire understand what might have driven David to such extreme measure. The most challenging aspect of Claire's situation was maintaining normalcy while conducting her investigation. Each morning, she had to smile at David over breakfast, listen to his work stories, and respond to his questions about her day as if nothing had changed between them. The effort required was exhausting, but Claire found strength in knowing that every day of successful dissection brought her closer to gathering enough evidence to expose David's crimes and protect herself. Her work at the community center provided the perfect cover for her activity. Claire's job naturally involved long hours, evening events, and frequent communication with various community members and professionals. She could schedule meetings with Dr. Wells under the guise of planning future health events, arrange lunch with Michael by claiming she needed advice on financial planning for community programs, and visit Aunt Helen as part of her regular family obligation. The hardest moments came during the quiet times at home, when Claire would catch glimpses of the man David used to be. Sometimes, when he was absorbed in watching television or working on his laptop, his guard would drop and his expression would soften into something that reminded her of their early years together. Those moments made her question whether she was imagining threats that didn't exist, whether stress and paranoia were causing her to misinterpret innocent actions as sinister plots. But then she would remember the metallic taste in her coffee, the way her symptoms had disappeared after she stopped drinking it, and the subtle but unmistakable changes in David's behavior over the past several months. The evidence of her own experience was too strong to dismiss, and her medical training had taught her to trust objective symptoms over subjective feeling. By the end of her first week of secret investigation, Claire had established a routine that allowed her to avoid the poisoned coffee while documenting David's behavior and reaching out to potential allies. She had scheduled an appointment with Dr. Wells for the following Tuesday, arranged to have lunch with Michael on Wednesday, and planned to visit Aunt Helen over the weekend. Each conversation would be carefully planned to gather information and support without revealing the full scope of her suspicions until she was certain about the people she could trust. The community center had become more than just her workplace. It was her sanctuary and her command center. In her office, surrounded by the familiar chaos of event planning materials and community outreach programs, Claire felt like herself again. Here she was competent and capable, someone who solved problems and helped others navigate complex challenges. The skills that made her effective in her job would serve her well in exposing David's crimes and ensuring that justice was served. As Friday evening approached, marking the end of her first week as a secret investigator in her own potential murder case, Claire sat in her office reviewing the notes she had hidden in her desk drawer. The documentation was already substantial, painting a picture of systematic poisoning that had been carefully planned and executed over several months. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, and with the right help from medical professionals and law enforcement, it would be enough to protect her and hold David accountable for his actions. The woman who had started the week as a potential victim was transforming into someone who refused to be destroyed by betrayal and manipulation. Claire Morgan was about to discover that the strength she had developed through years of caring for others could be just as powerful when turned toward protecting herself and seeking justice. The weekend arrived with the crisp October air that Claire had always associated with new beginnings. As she drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls toward Aunt Helen's house on Birch Lane, she rehearsed the conversation she needed to have without revealing too much too soon. Helen Carter lived in a cozy two-story colonial that had been her home for over 3 decades, its front yard still meticulously maintained, despite her age. The maple trees lining the street blazed with autumn colors, creating a canopy of gold and crimson that should have filled Claire with the seasonal joy she typically felt this time of year. Instead, her mind was focused on the manila envelope hidden beneath the passenger seat of her car, containing printed copies of her symptom diary and research about various poisoning methods. She had spent Friday evening at the community center after hours, using the office computer to research everything from arsenic to antifreeze, creating a comprehensive database of toxic substances that could be easily obtained and administered without immediate detection. The information she had discovered was both enlightening and terrifying. Helen answered the door with the warm smile that had comforted Claire through childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreak. At 72, she moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to respect her body's limitations, while refusing to let age define her capability. Her silver hair was pulled back in the same elegant chignon she had worn for as long as Claire could remember, and her blue eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her a formidable high school principal before her retirement. The house smelled of cinnamon and apple pie, evidence of Helen's weekend baking ritual that had continued even after Uncle Robert's death. Claire accepted a cup of tea and settled into the familiar comfort of Helen's living room, surrounded by family photographs and the collection of antique books that had been Robert's passion. The normalcy of the environment made her current situation feel even more surreal. Helen had always possessed an uncanny ability to sense when something was troubling her family members, and today was no exception. After the usual pleasantries about work and community events, she fixed Claire with a direct gaze that made evasion impossible. The conversation that followed would prove to be the first crucial step in building the support network that Claire would need to survive what was coming. Rather than launching directly into her suspicions about David, Claire began by describing her recent health problems in clinical terms that drew on her nursing background. She explained the metallic taste, the nausea, the tremors, and the headaches with the precision of someone presenting a case study rather than discussing her own potentially life-threatening situation. Helen listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious as the symptoms were detailed. When Claire mentioned that the symptoms had mysteriously disappeared after she stopped drinking her morning coffee, Helen's sharp intake of breath confirmed that the implications were not lost on her. The older woman had lived through enough family dramas and community scandals to recognize the signs of domestic trouble, but the possibility of systematic poisoning clearly shocked her. Her first response was to insist that Claire go directly to the emergency room, but Claire's explanation of why she needed evidence first gave Helen pause. The discussion that followed revealed Helen's unexpected knowledge about financial crimes and insurance fraud. During her years as a principal, she had dealt with several cases involving teachers who had embezzled funds or manipulated records for personal gain. Her experience with those situations had taught her the importance of building airtight cases before making accusations, especially when dealing with intelligent perpetrators who had covered their tracks carefully. Helen's revelation about David's behavior during family gatherings over the past year provided crucial context for Claire's growing suspicion. The older woman had noticed subtle changes in David's demeanor that she had attributed to work stress or marital difficulties, but in light of Claire's health problems, those observations took on a much darker significance. David had begun asking unusually specific questions about family finances, inheritance plans, and insurance policies during casual conversations that Helen had found intrusive but not necessarily alarming at the time. The most disturbing revelation came when Helen mentioned a conversation she had overheard between David and his sister Linda during Claire's birthday party 6 months earlier. Linda Hartwell had always struck Helen as a manipulative woman who resented her brother's marriage to someone she considered beneath their family's social status. The conversation had involved speculation about what would happen to Claire's share of the family property if something were to happen to her, with Linda suggesting that David would be better off financially and emotionally without the burden of a wife who couldn't give him children. Helen's account of that overheard conversation provided the first concrete evidence that David's potential crimes might not be entirely his own idea. Linda worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative, which meant she had extensive knowledge about medications, their effects, and how they could be obtained through professional channels. If she was involved in planning Claire's demise, her expertise would explain the sophisticated nature of the poisoning method being used. The afternoon spent with Helen transformed Claire's understanding of her situation from a personal betrayal by her husband to a more complex conspiracy involving multiple family members with clear financial motives. The life insurance policy that David had insisted on increasing now seemed like just one piece of a larger financial puzzle that included inheritance rights, property ownership, and possibly even David's standing in his family's social circle. Helen's practical advice proved as valuable as her emotional support. She suggested that Claire begin documenting her interactions with David using her phone's voice recording feature, creating an audio diary that could capture any incriminating statements or unusual behavior patterns. She also recommended that Claire establish a safety plan that included regular check-ins with trusted family members and a secure location where she could go if her situation became immediately dangerous. The drive home from Helen's house gave Claire time to process the afternoon's revelations and plan her approach for the upcoming week. Her appointment with Dr. Patricia Wells on Tuesday would focus on getting medical documentation of her symptoms and potentially testing for specific toxins that might still be detectable in her system. The lunch with Michael on Wednesday would involve sharing the financial aspects of her situation and getting his professional opinion about David's potential motives and methods. Sunday evening brought an unexpected development that added urgency to Claire's investigation. David announced that he had scheduled a long weekend getaway for the following month, suggesting that they needed time to reconnect and work on their marriage. The timing struck Claire as suspicious, particularly since David had shown little interest in romantic gestures or relationship repair during the past year. The possibility that he was planning to escalate his timeline for some reason made her realize that she might have less time than she had originally thought to gather evidence and protect herself. Monday morning required Claire to resume her performance as the unsuspecting wife while internally processing everything she had learned over the weekend. She disposed of her coffee with the same careful routine she had developed, but now she paid closer attention to David's behavior during the preparation process. She noticed that he was using a specific container for her coffee grounds that was separate from his own, and that he seemed to be adding something to her cup before pouring the coffee that he didn't add to his own. Her workday at the community center was punctuated by phone calls to Dr. Wells' office to confirm her appointment and to Michael to finalize their lunch plans. She also began reaching out to Rachel Stevens, her closest friend since college, who worked as a victim's advocate for the county prosecutor's office. Rachel's professional experience with domestic violence cases would be invaluable in helping Claire understand the legal aspects of her situation and the best ways to document evidence for potential criminal proceedings.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The conversation with Rachel took place during Claire's lunch break, in a corner booth at Riverside Cafe where they had met countless times over the years to celebrate successes and navigate life's challenges. Rachel's initial reaction to Claire's story was a mixture of professional concern and personal outrage that someone she cared about was being systematically victimized. Her expertise in domestic violence cases provided a framework for understanding David's behavior that went beyond the simple financial motives that Claire had initially considered. Rachel explained that domestic poisoning cases often involved perpetrators who felt a need to maintain control while eliminating their victims slowly enough to avoid suspicion. The method suggested someone who enjoyed the psychological aspects of the crime as much as the practical benefits, someone who derived satisfaction from gradually destroying their victim while maintaining a facade of caring and concern. This psychological profile matched disturbing changes in David's behavior that Claire had attributed to other causes. The legal advice that Rachel provided was both encouraging and sobering. While the evidence Claire had gathered so far was compelling, it would need to be supplemented with medical documentation and possibly law enforcement involvement to build a case that could withstand legal scrutiny. Rachel explained the process for obtaining restraining orders, the types of evidence that prosecutors would need to file criminal charges, and the importance of maintaining detailed documentation throughout the investigation process. Rachel's offer to connect Claire with Detective James Foster, a colleague who specialized in domestic violence cases and had experience with poisoning investigations, provided another crucial element for Claire's support network. Detective Foster's involvement would need to be carefully timed to avoid alerting David to the investigation, but having law enforcement ready to act when sufficient evidence was gathered would be essential for Claire's safety. Tuesday morning's appointment with Dr. Patricia Wells confirmed Claire's worst fears while providing the medical documentation she needed to support her case. The doctor's examination revealed several physical indicators consistent with chronic low-level poisoning, including changes in her blood pressure, subtle neurological symptoms, and trace amounts of heavy metals in her blood work that suggested ongoing exposure to toxic substances. Wells' professional demeanor couldn't hide her concern about the implications of Claire's test results. She recommended immediate cessation of any potentially contaminated food or beverages, which Claire was already doing, and suggested additional testing to identify the specific toxins involved. The doctor's willingness to document her findings in detailed medical records and to provide expert testimony if needed gave Claire's case the medical credibility it would require for legal proceedings. The blood test that Dr. Wells ordered would take several days to process, but the preliminary results were sufficient to confirm that Claire's suspicions were medically justified. The doctor's recommendation that Claire consider involving law enforcement immediately was tempered by her understanding of the need for comprehensive evidence gathering. She agreed to coordinate with Detective Foster when the time came to ensure that all medical evidence was properly preserved and documented. Wednesday's lunch with Michael brought the financial aspects of Claire's situation into sharp focus. His forensic accounting background enabled him to analyze David's potential motives with the same methodical approach he used in his professional fraud investigation. The life insurance policy increase was just the beginning of a pattern of financial maneuvering that had apparently been ongoing for several months. Michael's review of the information Claire provided revealed several red flags that she had missed. David had recently changed the beneficiaries on his retirement accounts, taken out a second mortgage on their house without discussing it with Claire, and made several large cash withdrawals that couldn't be easily explained by their normal spending pattern. The financial picture that emerged suggested someone who was either in serious financial trouble or was preparing for a major life change that would require immediate access to liquid assets. The most alarming discovery was that David had been researching Claire's family financial history, apparently trying to determine what assets she might inherit from Helen and other relatives. Michael's analysis suggested that David's interest in Claire's potential inheritance was far more detailed and calculating than casual curiosity would explain. The timing of his research coincided with the beginning of Claire's health problems, suggesting a direct connection between financial planning and the poisoning timeline. Michael's professional connections in the financial industry would prove invaluable in tracking David's activities and identifying any additional suspicious transactions. He offered to conduct a comprehensive analysis of David's financial records using methods that would remain undetectable while providing Claire with detailed information about his activities and potential co-conspirator. The revelation that David had been in contact with Linda Hartwell much more frequently than Claire realized added another layer of complexity to the conspiracy. Michael's phone records analysis, conducted through legitimate channels available to forensic accountants, showed a pattern of communication between David and Linda that had intensified significantly during the period when Claire's health problems began. The frequency and timing of their conversations suggested coordination and planning rather than casual family communication. By the end of her second week of investigation, Claire had assembled a comprehensive picture of a conspiracy that involved systematic poisoning, financial manipulation, and careful planning to eliminate her while maximizing the financial benefits to David and his sister. The evidence was substantial enough to support criminal charges, but Rachel's advice was to continue gathering documentation until the case was absolutely airtight. The psychological toll of maintaining her performance as the unsuspecting wife while conducting a complex investigation was beginning to affect Claire's daily life. Sleep became increasingly difficult as her mind raced through the implications of each new discovery, and the effort required to appear normal during her interactions with David was exhausting. The knowledge that her husband was actively trying to kill her while maintaining a facade of concern and affection made every moment in his presence feel like a dangerous performance. The support network that Claire had assembled was proving to be her lifeline during this period. Daily check-ins with Helen provided emotional stability and practical advice, while her professional relationships with Dr. Wells, Rachel, and Michael gave her the technical expertise she needed to build a solid case. Each member of her team brought unique skills and perspectives that strengthened her overall investigation. Detective Foster's initial review of Claire's evidence confirmed that she had built a strong foundation for criminal prosecution. His experience with similar cases provided valuable insights into the best methods for gathering additional evidence without alerting the perpetrator. The detective's willingness to coordinate with Claire's team of allies ensured that all evidence would be properly collected and preserved according to legal standards. The plan that emerged from these consultations was methodical and comprehensive. Claire would continue avoiding the poisoned coffee while documenting David's behavior and gathering additional evidence about his financial activities and communications with Lynn. Medical testing would continue to identify the specific toxins being used and document their effects on Claire's health. Financial analysis would track David's activities and identify any additional suspicious transactions or planning activity. The timeline for action was deliberately conservative, designed to ensure that all evidence was properly gathered and documented before any confrontation occurred. Rachel's experience with domestic violence cases emphasized the importance of having law enforcement ready to act immediately once David became aware of the investigation, since that moment would represent the highest danger period for Claire's safety. Friday evening brought another unexpected development when David announced that Linda would be visiting the following weekend. The timing of her visit, combined with David's suggestion that they plan something special for her stay, raised new concerns about potential escalation of the conspiracy. Claire's team agreed that Linda's visit might represent an opportunity to gather additional evidence, but it would also require extra precautions to ensure Claire's safety during a period when both conspirators would be present. The second week of investigation had transformed Claire's understanding of her situation from a simple case of domestic poisoning to a complex conspiracy involving multiple perpetrators, sophisticated planning, and substantial financial motive. The evidence she had gathered was compelling and comprehensive, but the revelation that the conspiracy was more extensive than she had initially realized meant that her safety measures would need to be equally sophisticated. The call came at 7 in the morning on the day Linda Hartwell was scheduled to arrive. Claire had been awake for over an hour, lying in bed beside David and listening to his steady breathing while her mind raced through the carefully planned sequence of events that would unfold over the next few days. When her phone buzzed with Rachel's number, she slipped quietly from the bedroom and answered from the kitchen, where David's coffee preparation ritual would begin in another 30 minutes. Rachel's voice carried an urgency that immediately heightened Claire's alertness. Detective Foster had been conducting background research on Linda Hartwell and had uncovered information that dramatically expanded their understanding of the conspiracy. Linda's pharmaceutical sales career had provided her with access to controlled substances that went far beyond what they had initially suspected, and her financial records showed a pattern of suspicious activity that paralleled David's own questionable transactions. The most disturbing revelation was that Linda had been involved in 2 previous insurance claim investigations where the circumstances had raised red flags but hadn't resulted in criminal charges. In both cases, family members had died under circumstances that could be explained by natural causes but had generated enough suspicion to prompt detailed investigation. The fact that Linda had benefited financially from both deaths, while maintaining plausible deniability about any wrongdoing, suggested a level of experience and sophistication that made her far more dangerous than Claire had initially realized. Detective Foster's research had also uncovered a connection between Linda and a network of individuals involved in insurance fraud schemes across multiple states. The detective's contacts with federal investigators revealed that Linda was already under surveillance as part of a larger investigation into organized insurance fraud, which meant that Claire's case could potentially become part of a much larger criminal prosecution. This new information required immediate adjustments to the plans that Claire and her team had carefully developed. The weekend visit from Linda now represented both an opportunity to gather crucial evidence and a significant escalation of the danger to Claire's safety. Detective Foster was positioning surveillance equipment around Claire's house and would have backup units ready to respond immediately if the situation became dangerous. Dr. Wells had expedited the toxicology results from Claire's blood tests, and the findings provided definitive proof of the poisoning that had been occurring. The specific combination of substances detected in Claire's system was sophisticated enough to suggest professional knowledge of pharmacology, which supported the theory that Linda's expertise was being used to orchestrate the poison. The toxins were being administered in doses calculated to cause gradual deterioration rather than immediate symptoms, indicating a plan designed to simulate natural illness over an extended period. Michael's financial analysis had uncovered additional evidence of coordination between David and Linda that went back much further than anyone had initially suspected. Bank records showed a pattern of communication and financial transfers between the siblings that suggested they had been planning something involving Claire for over a year. The timeline coincided with several significant events in Claire's life, including her miscarriage and the subsequent fertility treatments that had strained both her marriage and their finances. The revelation that David and Linda had been planning Claire's elimination for such an extended period transformed her understanding of recent events in their marriage. Conversations and decisions that she had attributed to normal marital stress now appeared to be calculated moves designed to isolate her and position her for elimination. David's increased control over their finances, his insistence on handling all insurance matters, and his gradual withdrawal from her family and friends all took on new significance in light of the long-term planning that had apparently been occurring. Aunt Helen's role in the investigation had evolved beyond emotional support to active intelligence gathering. Her position as a respected longtime resident of Cedar Falls gave her access to information and community connections that proved invaluable in understanding the broader context of David and Linda's activity. Helen had spent the week discreetly inquiring about the Hartwell family's recent financial activities and had discovered that they were facing significant financial pressures that provided additional motive for their crime. The Hartwell family's construction business, which had been struggling since the economic downturn, was apparently on the verge of bankruptcy. Linda's pharmaceutical sales position was also under threat due to corporate restructuring, which meant that both siblings were facing financial crises that made Claire's life insurance policy and potential inheritance particularly attractive. The desperation of their financial situation suggested that they might be willing to take greater risks to accelerate their timeline. Helen's investigation had also revealed that Linda had been making inquiries about Claire's health and family medical history during her visits to Cedar Falls over the past year. Local residents who had spoken with Linda reported that she had asked detailed questions about genetic diseases, family longevity, and Claire's specific health challenges in ways that seemed unusually intrusive even for a concerned sister-in-law. These conversations now appeared to be reconnaissance designed to help plan the poisoning method and timeline. The community center had become Claire's operational headquarters, where she could coordinate with her team members and prepare for the complex surveillance operation that would take place during Linda's visit. Her office provided a secure location for storing evidence and communicating with law enforcement without risk of detection from David. The legitimacy of her work responsibilities also provided cover for the increased time she was spending on planning and coordination activity. Claire's colleagues at the community center had begun to notice changes in her behavior and appearance that she attributed to stress from organizing several major upcoming events. The explanation was plausible enough to avoid suspicion, but several coworkers had expressed concern about her well-being and offered assistance with her workload. Their genuine care and support provided an additional layer of emotional strength during a period when maintaining her facade at home was becoming increasingly difficult. The recording equipment that Detective Foster had provided would allow Claire to capture conversations between David and Linda that might reveal additional details about their plans or provide direct evidence of conspiracy. The devices were sophisticated enough to be virtually undetectable while providing high-quality audio that would be admissible in criminal proceedings. Claire had practiced using the equipment extensively to ensure that she could operate it naturally during social interaction. Rachel's coaching on behavioral techniques for gathering evidence, had prepared Claire for the psychological challenges of the weekend ahead. The need to appear normal and unsuspecting while actively working to gather evidence against people who were trying to kill her required a level of performance that was both emotionally and physically exhausting. Rachel's experience with other victims had taught her specific strategies for managing stress and maintaining focus during high-stakes investigative activities. The safety protocols that had been established for the weekend were comprehensive and multi-layered. Claire would maintain regular contact with team members through coded text messages that would alert them to any changes in her situation or immediate danger. Detective Foster would have surveillance teams positioned around the house with the ability to intervene immediately if Claire activated emergency protocols. Dr. Wells would be on standby to provide immediate medical assistance if needed. Friday afternoon brought the first test of these preparations when David announced that he had picked up special coffee beans for Linda's visit, claiming that he wanted to impress his sister with his newfound expertise in coffee preparation. The timing and circumstances of this announcement raised immediate red flags for Claire, who suspected that the special beans might be part of a plan to escalate the poisoning during Linda's visit. The analysis of David's behavior patterns over the past week had revealed subtle changes that suggested increased anxiety and anticipation. His phone conversations had become more frequent and secretive, and he had been spending unusual amounts of time researching travel destinations and making what appeared to be contingency plans. The pattern suggested that significant events were planned for the near future, possibly coinciding with Linda's visit. Claire's performance during dinner that Friday evening required her to express enthusiasm about Linda's visit, while internally preparing for what might be the most dangerous weekend of her life. David's behavior had taken on an artificial quality that reminded her of the way he had acted during the early stages of their courtship, when he had been trying to impress her with elaborate gestures and carefully planned surprises. The similarity was unsettling and suggested that he was preparing for some kind of performance of his own. The evening routine that had once been comfortable and familiar now felt like a carefully choreographed dance where every move had potential significance. Claire found herself analyzing David's every gesture and comment for hidden meanings while maintaining the appearance of normal domestic interaction. The mental effort required was exhausting, but the knowledge that Detective Foster's surveillance team was already in position provided some reassurance about her safety. Saturday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather that David declared perfect for showing Linda around Cedar Falls and introducing her to some of their favorite local attractions. His enthusiasm for playing tour guide seemed forced and artificial, particularly since he had never shown much interest in entertaining family members during previous visits. Claire suspected that the planned activities were designed to establish alibis and create opportunities for private conversations between the siblings. Linda's arrival at mid-morning brought the first direct confirmation that Claire's suspicions about her involvement were accurate. The woman who embraced her with apparent warmth and sisterly affection was clearly performing for David's benefit, but her eyes held a calculating coldness that made Claire's skin crawl. Linda's questions about Claire's health and recent activities were phrased with seeming concern but carried an undertone of professional assessment that suggested she was evaluating the success of their poisoning effort. The conversation during lunch at Riverside Cafe provided the first opportunity to test the recording equipment while gathering intelligence about Linda's knowledge of the conspiracy. Linda's comments about Claire's appearance included observations about weight loss and changes in skin tone that could only have come from someone who was monitoring the effects of systematic poisoning. Her suggestions about vitamins and health supplements were particularly suspicious, given her pharmaceutical background and the possibility that she was planning to introduce additional toxic substances. David's behavior during the lunch conversation revealed the extent to which he had been performing their entire marriage. His attentiveness to Claire and apparent concern for her well-being were clearly being displayed for Linda's benefit, but the artificial quality of his performance made it obvious that his genuine feelings were very different. The contrast between his public persona and the man she lived with daily became starkly apparent when viewed through the lens of her current knowledge. The afternoon tour of Cedar Falls that David had planned included stops at several locations that seemed to have special significance for the sibling. Their whispered conversations at each location suggested that they were discussing logistics and timing for activities that Claire was not meant to overhear. The recording equipment captured fragments of these conversations that would later prove crucial for understanding the full scope of their plans. Linda's professional interest in the local hospital and pharmacy during their tour was particularly revealing. Her questions about emergency procedures, staffing levels and response times for various types of medical situations suggested that she was gathering information for contingency planning. The possibility that they were preparing for a medical emergency that they intended to create was both chilling and informative for Claire's understanding of their method. The evening dinner at home provided the most revealing conversations of the day, as Linda and David discussed family financial matters with unusual specificity. Their conversation about inheritance laws, insurance procedures, and estate planning contained details that suggested they had been researching these topics extensively. Linda's knowledge about the specific terms of Claire's life insurance policy was particularly alarming, since that information should not have been readily available to her. The recording equipment captured Linda's suggestion that David should consider increasing Claire's policy even further, along with her recommendation of specific insurance companies that she claimed had more favorable payout procedure. The clinical nature of their discussion about Claire's potential death made it clear that they viewed her elimination as a business transaction rather than a personal crime. Sunday morning brought the most dangerous phase of the weekend when Linda suggested that she and David prepare a special breakfast for Claire as a gesture of family appreciation. The offer immediately activated Claire's emergency protocols, as the opportunity to control her food preparation represented the perfect chance for them to administer a lethal dose of whatever toxins they had been using. Claire's response required delicate balancing to appear grateful while avoiding consumption of anything they prepared. The breakfast conversation provided additional intelligence about their timeline and method. Linda's comments about how quickly Claire might recover from her recent health problems suggested that they were planning to accelerate their activities soon. Her recommendations about reducing Claire's coffee consumption, supposedly for health reasons, indicated that they were aware their current method was being detected and might need to change their approach. The coded text messages that Claire sent to her team throughout the weekend provided real-time intelligence that allowed Detective Foster to adjust surveillance and response plans as the situation developed. The information gathered during Linda's visit would prove crucial for understanding the full scope of the conspiracy and the immediate dangers that Claire faced. Monday morning's departure of Linda marked the end of the most intensive evidence-gathering phase of Claire's investigation. The recordings and observations from the weekend had provided definitive proof of conspiracy and revealed details about timing and methods that would be essential for law enforcement action. The investigation had reached the point where continued surveillance was becoming too dangerous, and the time for direct action was approaching rapidly. Tuesday morning dawned gray and cold, matching the storm that was about to break over David Hartwell's carefully constructed world. Claire sat in her office at the community center, surrounded by the evidence that would destroy her husband's life just as surely as he had tried to destroy hers. Detective Foster's voice crackled through the secure phone line as he confirmed that the federal task force was ready to move.
The recordings from Linda's weekend visit had provided the final pieces of evidence needed to support charges of conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and racketeering. The plan that had been months in the making would unfold with precision timing designed to catch both conspirators before they could destroy evidence or flee. Linda was currently at her hotel preparing for what she believed would be a routine sales call, unaware that federal agents were already positioned around the building. David was at his office at Midwest Insurance Adjusters, where he had spent the morning making phone calls that Detective Foster's surveillance team had been monitoring and recording. Claire's role in the morning's events required her to maintain her normal routine while being prepared to respond to rapidly changing circumstances. Her colleagues at the community center had been briefed about the possibility of law enforcement activity, though they had been told only that Claire was assisting with an ongoing investigation. The support and understanding they had shown reinforced her decision to trust the people around her, rather than face this crisis alone. Dr. Wells had provided final medical documentation that established a clear timeline of Claire's poisoning and its effects on her health. The blood work results showed definitive proof of multiple toxic substances that had been administered over several months, with concentrations that would have been lethal if continued much longer. The medical evidence was comprehensive enough to support attempted murder charges, and would be crucial for establishing the premeditated nature of the crime. Rachel Stevens arrived at the community center just after 9 o'clock, bringing news that the federal prosecutors were prepared to seek maximum sentences for both David and Linda. The conspiracy charges alone carried potential sentences of 25 years to life, and the additional charges related to the insurance fraud network could add decades more. The scope of the federal investigation had revealed that Claire's case was just one part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had victimized families across multiple states. The morning's first dramatic moment came when Detective Foster called to report that David had just made a series of urgent phone calls to Linda, apparently trying to accelerate their timeline for reasons that weren't immediately clear. The surveillance team reported that David seemed agitated and was gathering personal items from his office as if preparing for an extended absence. The change in behavior suggested that something had triggered his suspicions about the investigation. Claire's phone rang at exactly 10:15 with David's number on the display. His voice carried a forced casualness that immediately put her on alert as he suggested they meet for lunch at their usual spot to discuss the weekend plans he claimed to be making for their anniversary. The invitation felt like a trap, particularly given the timing and his unusual eagerness to meet in a public place where he could control the conversation. The decision to accept David's lunch invitation was made jointly by Claire and the law enforcement team, with extensive safety precautions in place to protect her during what might be David's attempt to manipulate or silence her. Detective Foster's surveillance team would monitor the restaurant from multiple positions, and Claire would wear recording equipment that would capture any incriminating statements David might make. The federal agents moved into position around Linda's hotel at 11 o'clock, just as she was concluding what she believed was a routine business meeting. The arrest was swift and decisive, with agents presenting evidence of her involvement in the conspiracy before she could formulate denials or contact David. Linda's shocked reaction to being confronted with recordings of her conversations with David provided the first confirmation that the conspiracy was even more extensive than investigators had suspected. Linda's immediate attempt to negotiate by offering information about other victims and co-conspirators revealed the true scope of the criminal network she and David had been operating. Her pharmaceutical industry connections had provided access to controlled substances that were being distributed to accomplices in multiple states, and her insurance industry knowledge had helped identify potential victims whose deaths would generate substantial payouts for family members. The interrogation team that questioned Linda discovered that Claire had been selected as a target over a year ago, when David's financial problems had become critical and Linda had suggested that eliminating his wife would solve multiple problems simultaneously. The calculation that had gone into choosing Claire as a victim was chilling in its clinical detachment, treating her life as nothing more than a financial asset to be liquidated when convenient. Meanwhile, Claire prepared for her lunch meeting with David by reviewing the conversation strategies that Rachel had taught her for eliciting incriminating statements from suspects. The goal was to give David enough rope to hang himself while maintaining her own safety and gathering evidence that would support the criminal charges being prepared against him. The recording equipment she wore was sophisticated enough to capture every word while remaining completely undetectable. The drive to Riverside Cafe felt like traveling to her own execution, even though Claire knew that Detective Foster's team was monitoring her every move. The familiar route through Cedar Falls took on an ominous quality as she realized this might be her last normal interaction with the man who had shared her life for 13 years. The transformation from loving husband to would-be murderer was still difficult for her to fully comprehend, despite all the evidence she had gathered. David was already seated at their usual corner table when Claire arrived, and his appearance shocked her with its dramatic change from just the day before. His normally immaculate grooming was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot from apparent lack of sleep, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. The stress of orchestrating her murder while maintaining his facade of normalcy had clearly taken a significant toll on his mental and physical condition. The conversation that followed would be replayed countless times during the legal proceedings that were to come, as David's desperate attempts to manipulate Claire into drinking coffee he had prepared specially for their lunch provided unmistakable evidence of his murderous intent. His insistence that she try the new blend he had discovered, combined with his visible agitation when she declined, created a scene that was both pathetic and terrifying. David's behavior during lunch revealed the complete breakdown of his psychological facade as the pressure of his crimes finally overwhelmed his ability to maintain normal appearances. His attempts to steer the conversation toward topics like their future plans, insurance policies, and what would happen if something unexpected occurred in their lives were so transparent that Claire wondered how she had ever trusted this man with her safety and well-being. The moment that sealed David's fate came when he received a phone call that he claimed was from work but was actually news of Linda's arrest. His reaction to learning that his sister had been taken into custody provided clear evidence of their conspiracy, as his immediate panic and attempts to leave the restaurant demonstrated consciousness of guilt that no innocent person would display. Claire's decision to confront David directly about her knowledge of the poisoning created the most dramatic moment of their entire relationship. His initial denials gave way to desperate justifications as he realized that his carefully planned crime was unraveling beyond any hope of recovery. The recording of his admission that he had been adding substances to her coffee, combined with his attempts to rationalize his actions by blaming their marriage problems and financial pressures, provided prosecution evidence that would be impossible to refute. The arrival of Detective Foster and his team at the restaurant marked the end of David's freedom and the beginning of Claire's vindication. David's attempts to run from the restaurant were futile, as law enforcement had anticipated every possible escape route and positioned officers accordingly. His arrest, conducted in full view of other diners who recognized both him and Claire from their years as Cedar Falls residents, created a public spectacle that would dominate local news coverage for weeks to come. The evidence that emerged during David's initial interrogation revealed details about the conspiracy that even Claire's extensive investigation had not uncovered. David's confession, given in hope of receiving a lighter sentence, described a methodical plan to eliminate Claire over a 6-month period using a combination of toxic substances that would simulate natural illness and eventually result in organ failure that could be attributed to genetic factors or environmental causes. The sophistication of the murder method demonstrated the extent of Linda's pharmaceutical expertise and David's insurance industry knowledge. They had researched Claire's family medical history extensively, identifying conditions that could plausibly explain the symptoms they were inducing through systematic poisoning. The plan was designed to avoid detection even during autopsy, as the substances they were using would metabolize in ways that could be mistaken for natural biological processes. The financial investigation that accompanied the criminal charges revealed that David and Linda had already begun spending money they expected to receive from Claire's death. David had made down payments on a new house and a luxury car, while Linda had invested in expanding her pharmaceutical sales territory in preparation for the increased income she anticipated from their criminal activity. The premature spending provided additional evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. The federal task force's investigation into the broader criminal network revealed that Claire was intended to be the first in a series of victims that David and Linda planned to target over the coming year. They had identified other potential victims in neighboring states, all of whom were married women with substantial life insurance policies and limited family support networks that would make their deaths less likely to generate suspicion or extensive investigation. The courthouse appearance for David and Linda's initial arraignment drew media attention from across the region, as the details of their conspiracy captured public imagination and outrage. Claire found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight as the survivor of an attempted murder that demonstrated the darkest aspects of domestic betrayal and family grief. The support she received from the Cedar Falls community helped sustain her through the emotional challenges of seeing her former life dissected in public forum. Linda's attorney's attempts to negotiate a plea agreement by offering testimony against David and other members of their criminal network provided prosecutors with evidence of crimes spanning multiple states and involving dozens of potential victims. The scope of the criminal enterprise that Linda had helped orchestrate was staggering in its ambition and callous disregard for human life. David's legal team's strategy of claiming that he had been manipulated by Linda into participating in crimes he didn't fully understand fell apart when confronted with evidence of his active participation in planning and research activity. His internet search history revealed months of research into poisoning methods, insurance fraud techniques, and ways to avoid detection during criminal investigation. The psychological evaluations ordered by the court revealed that both David and Linda displayed personality traits consistent with psychopathic behavior, including lack of empathy, superficial charm, and grandiose self-regard. The expert testimony about their psychological profiles helped explain how they had been able to maintain normal social relationships while planning and executing such heinous crimes. The victim impact statements that Claire and others provided during the sentencing phase of the proceedings, highlighted the devastating effects of David and Linda's crimes beyond the immediate physical harm they had caused. Claire's description of the psychological trauma of discovering that her husband had been systematically poisoning her while maintaining a facade of love and concern moved courtroom observers to tears and influenced the judge's sentencing decision. The final sentencing hearing brought closure to a legal process that had consumed months of Claire's life and forever changed her understanding of human nature and the potential for evil that could exist beneath seemingly normal facades. David's sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole reflected the court's recognition of the premeditated and calculating nature of his crimes, while Linda's sentence of 45 years acknowledged her role as the mastermind behind the broader criminal conspiracy. The moment when the judge's gavel fell for the final time marked not just the end of David and Linda's freedom, but the beginning of Claire's journey toward rebuilding a life that had been shattered by betrayal and nearly ended by poison. The woman who walked out of the courthouse that day bore little resemblance to the naive wife who had first noticed a metallic taste in her morning coffee months early. 6 months after the courthouse doors closed on David and Linda's criminal trials, Claire Morgan stood in the kitchen of her new apartment across town holding a steaming mug of coffee that she had prepared herself. The simple act of enjoying her morning brew without fear or suspicion represented a freedom that she had never expected to treasure so deeply. The apartment on Elm Street was smaller than the house she had shared with David, but every corner of it belonged entirely to her, unmarked by memories of betrayal or the lingering shadows of attempted murder. The sale of the Maple Street house had been finalized just 2 weeks earlier, with the proceeds providing Claire with financial independence that she was still learning to navigate. The legal battles over the property had been complicated by David's attempts to claim ownership rights from prison, but the criminal conviction had ultimately invalidated any claims he might have had to assets obtained through fraud and conspiracy. The house that had once represented their shared dreams now served as a stark reminder of how completely she had misjudged the man she had married. Detective Foster had called the previous evening to inform her that the federal investigation into Linda's criminal network had resulted in 17 additional arrests across 6 states. The scope of the conspiracy that Claire had unknowingly helped expose continued to expand as investigators followed leads that connected her case to similar crimes dating back over a decade. Her survival and decision to fight back had potentially saved dozens of other potential victims from the same fate that David and Linda had planned for her. The community center had offered Claire a promotion to director of operations, recognizing both her professional competence and the strength of character she had demonstrated throughout her ordeal. The new position would involve overseeing multiple community programs and managing a larger staff, challenges that excited her in ways that her previous work had not. The opportunity to take on greater responsibilities felt like a natural evolution from the leadership skills she had developed while orchestrating her own investigation and survival. Rachel Stevens had become more than a professional ally during the months of legal proceedings. Their shared experience had forged a friendship that provided Claire with emotional support and practical guidance as she navigated her new life. Rachel's expertise in victim advocacy had helped Claire understand the psychological aspects of recovery from betrayal trauma, and her personal friendship had provided stability during the most difficult periods of adjustment. The coffee shop that Claire had been frequenting since moving to her new apartment had become an unexpected source of community connection. The owner, Maria Santos, was a widow in her 50s who had started the business after her husband's death from cancer 3 years earlier. Their conversations over morning coffee had evolved into a friendship based on mutual understanding of loss and the challenge of rebuilding life after devastating betrayal. Maria's story of discovering her husband's gambling addiction and secret debts after his death had provided Claire with perspective on how people could hide destructive secrets from those closest to them. The financial devastation that Maria had faced was different from Claire's experience, but the sense of having lived with a stranger while believing in a loving marriage created a bond between them that transcended their different circumstances. The therapy sessions that Claire had been attending twice weekly had helped her process the complex emotions that accompanied surviving attempted murder by someone she had loved and trusted. Jennifer Walsh, a psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, had guided Claire through the difficult work of distinguishing between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear as she learned to trust her instincts and judgment again. the support group for domestic violence survivors that Walsh had recommended initially felt uncomfortable for Claire, who struggled to see herself as fitting into that category. The gradual realization that poisoning was indeed a form of domestic violence and that her experience shared common elements with other forms of intimate partner abuse had been both painful and liberating. The other women in the group had provided perspectives on healing and empowerment that no professional counselor could have offered. Michael's forensic accounting firm had offered Claire a consulting position that would allow her to use her investigative skills and attention to detail in helping other victims of financial fraud. The work would be part-time initially, complementing her community center responsibilities while providing her with additional income and the satisfaction of helping people who had experienced betrayals similar to her own. The opportunity to transform her painful experience into a tool for helping others felt like a meaningful way to honor the strength she had discovered within herself. Aunt Helen had become even more central to Claire's life in the aftermath of the trials, serving not only as emotional support but as a source of practical wisdom about building a new life after profound loss. Helen's experience with widowhood had provided her with insights into the process of rediscovering personal identity after years of defining oneself primarily in relation to a spouse. Her encouragement had been crucial in helping Claire embrace the possibility of happiness and fulfillment as a single woman. The garden that Claire had started on the small patio of her new apartment represented both a connection to her past love of growing things and a symbol of new life taking root in unexpected places. The herbs and vegetables she was cultivating served practical purposes in her cooking, but the daily care they required also provided meditation and grounding that helped manage the anxiety that sometimes still surfaced unexpected. The legal settlement with David's insurance company had provided Claire with compensation for the medical expenses and lost income related to her poisoning, but more importantly, it had established legal precedent for holding insurance companies accountable when their employees used their positions to facilitate crime. The settlement had been structured to include funding for a scholarship program at the local nursing school, allowing Claire's experience to contribute to training future healthcare professionals who might encounter similar situations. Wells had asked Claire to speak at a medical conference about recognizing the signs of systematic poisoning in domestic situations. The presentation had been emotionally challenging but professionally rewarding, as Claire was able to help educate healthcare providers about subtle symptoms that might otherwise be overlooked or attributed to other causes. The positive response from medical professionals had led to additional speaking opportunities that allowed Claire to advocate for better training and awareness. The book that Claire had begun writing about her experience was taking shape as both a cautionary tale and a guide for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Working with a local publisher who specialized in true crime and survivor stories, Claire was crafting a narrative that emphasized empowerment and practical strategies rather than dwelling on victimization and trauma. The writing process had become therapeutic while also serving the practical purpose of documenting important lessons for other potential victims. The dating conversation that Maria had initiated over coffee one morning had caught Claire completely off guard, but the discussion had helped her begin thinking about the possibility of romantic relationships in her future. The idea of trusting someone enough to share daily life felt impossible at the moment, but Claire was beginning to understand that healing was a process that might eventually make such trust possible again. The volunteer work that Claire had taken on with a local organization that helped other crime victims navigate the legal system had provided her with a sense of purpose that extended beyond her own recovery. Her experience with gathering evidence, working with law enforcement and surviving the court process had given her practical knowledge that proved invaluable to people facing similar challenges. The work was emotionally demanding but deeply satisfying. The financial planning sessions that Claire had been attending helped her develop confidence in managing the money she had received from various settlements and the sale of her former home. Learning to make investment decisions and long-term financial plans without considering a spouse's input or preferences required adjusting to a level of independence that was both liberating and occasionally overwhelming. The self-defense classes that Rachel had convinced Claire to attend had initially felt unnecessary since the specific threats she had faced were unlikely to be repeated. However, the physical training had provided psychological benefits that extended far beyond practical protection skills. The sense of physical capability and confidence that came from learning to defend herself had contributed to an overall feeling of empowerment and control over her own safety. The holidays had been particularly challenging as they marked the first celebrations that Claire had experienced as a single person in over a decade. Thanksgiving dinner with Helen and Michael had been smaller and quieter than the large family gatherings she was accustomed to, but the intimacy and genuine affection of the occasion had provided comfort and hope for creating new traditions that reflected her current life rather than clinging to past patterns. The news that Linda had died in prison from a heart attack brought mixed emotions for Claire. While there was a sense of justice in knowing that Linda would never have the opportunity to harm other potential victims, Claire also felt a complicated sadness about the waste of a life that could have been used for positive purposes if different choices had been made. The death brought closure to one chapter of the legal proceedings while raising questions about David's psychological state as he faced the reality of life imprisonment. The anniversary of David's arrest had passed without the emotional devastation that Claire had expected. Instead of marking the date as a trauma anniversary, she had chosen to celebrate it as the beginning of her survival and empowerment. The decision to reframe the date as a positive milestone rather than a painful memory represented a significant step in her psychological recovery and demonstrated the progress she had made in taking control of her own narrative. The job interview at a nonprofit organization focused on domestic violence prevention had gone well, offering Claire the possibility of transitioning from her community center work to a role that would allow her to use her experience more directly in helping other potential victims. The position would involve developing educational programs and training materials for healthcare providers, law enforcement officers, and community organizations about recognizing and responding to intimate partner violence. The house hunting expedition that Claire had begun with Helen's assistance represented the next phase of building her independent life. The small cottage on the outskirts of Cedar Falls that had captured her attention offered the privacy and security she valued while providing space for a larger garden and the possibility of getting a dog for companionship and protection. The prospect of truly owning her own space, chosen entirely according to her own preferences and needs, felt like the ultimate symbol of her transformation from victim to survivor. The coffee in Claire's mug had grown cold while she stood lost in reflection about the journey that had brought her to this moment. As she poured the remainder down the sink and prepared a fresh cup, she smiled at the irony of how coffee had been both the weapon used against her and now a symbol of her daily freedom and independence. The simple act of drinking coffee without fear had become a morning ritual that reminded her of her strength and resilience. The phone call from Detective Foster brought news that another arrest had been made in connection with Linda's criminal network, this time involving a case that showed direct evidence of Claire's investigation having prevented additional murder. The knowledge that her decision to fight back rather than accept victimization had saved other lives provided validation for all the pain and effort she had endured during the investigation and legal proceeding. The woman who looked back at Claire from the bathroom mirror bore little resemblance to the frightened wife who had first suspected her husband was poisoning her coffee. The face was older and perhaps wiser, marked by experiences that had tested every aspect of her character and judgment, but the eyes held a confidence and strength that had been earned through surviving the ultimate betrayal and choosing to build something meaningful from the wreckage of her former life. The morning sun streaming through her apartment windows illuminated the small space that represented so much more than just a place to live. It was a sanctuary that belonged entirely to her, a foundation for building whatever life she chose to create, and a symbol of her refusal to be destroyed by the evil that others had tried to bring into her world. As Claire prepared to leave for work at the community center, she carried with her the knowledge that surviving attempted murder was just the beginning of her story, not the end. The future that stretched ahead was hers to write, and she intended to fill it with purpose, growth, and the kind of authentic relationships that were built on truth rather than deception. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.